Let's talk about Kerry Max Cook. He was convicted in 1978 of murdering a woman acquaintance, and he was wrongly imprisoned in Texas for 22 years. We know the death penalty in Texas is really serious if you're on death row there.
They'll get you at some point.
Yeah, exactly. Tell us a little about Kerry Max.
Kerry Max Cook, played by William Waxman. So I do want to give kudos to the actors here. Kerry Max Cook came out of prison exonerated, almost like a 19-year-old guy. He went in at age 19, and he came out still thinking he was back in the 60s or 70s. So a smart man, but not an evolved man, because he had been out of society for so long. And what had happened is that a woman that he did not know, that he had not seen, that he was nowhere near, was murdered. And her roommate identified him as the person that she observed last with the victim. And that was the foundational evidence, that and a fingerprint. Now, this, by the way, was an area that Kerry Max Cook was around for quite a while. I mean, the building. And that fingerprint, plus the fact that I saw him there the night of the crime, and saw him before this person died, got him a conviction. And I think there was I think there's a lot of questionable aspects to the prosecution of that case.
Exactly.
But what happened with him is that he was accused of being a homosexual before he got in to the prison as part of the prosecution's strategy, saying he was a homosexual maniac, and using that homophobic thing toward the jury. He was brutally abused in prison, raped, sodomized, marked, cut, beaten, and scars all over his body. That's a tragic situation. It turned out that the DNA evidence that ultimately came out exonerated him completely. It was not his blood. It was not his clothing fibers. It had nothing. He was not anywhere near the scene. And there was a person in fairly high position whose DNA, I think that was, and that person was never investigated, let alone prosecuted.
So like Jerry was saying, there are people running around that are guilty of crimes.
And Kerry Max Cook has an interesting outcome to his story, because he got married to a very educated woman. He got back into a business type career. And if you look at him now, he wears clothes to cover all the markings on his body, but he looks like a businessman. He seems to have acclimated to the circumstances of his life. Not everybody has. Not all of these people were angels, by the way.
I know.
But neither were they convicted properly. And he had a couple of minor misdemeanor convictions. He reckless driving or whatever it might have been. But he was not a murderer, and he was nowhere near the scene, and yet he was convicted.
Jerry, you played the husband, one of the many roles you play, for Sonia Jacobs. She was convicted in 1976 for murdering 2 policemen. She was wrongly imprisoned in Florida for 16 years. And we're talking about the South here, so you want to put that in perspective. And she had a co-convicted person. Tell us about your perspective of her conviction.
Every one of the stories, the character that you play wonderfully, by the way, and Ed's character, are tragedies. Hers might be the greatest tragedy of all, because she happened to be in Florida with her significant other. They were not married. They had 2 children, and they just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time in a car with a guy who actually killed 2 policemen and later confessed to killing the 2 policemen after she and her husband had been convicted of the murder, the double murder, and they were separated, put in separate prisons. The true culprit confessed in or about 1979. She was imprisoned until 1992. She was kept in jail for another 13 years, even after the the confession by the real culprit. And I remember this vividly now. The real tragedy is that her husband, the exoneration did not, for some reason, even though they had this testimony from the real culprit in 1979, her husband was actually executed in the electric chair. And it's a very tragic and famous
high-profile case because
story.
Of how the electric chair dysfunctioned.
3 times, and they had to go after him 3 times. And the great tragedy is they were in the car where the murders occurred. They were driving with this other person, but they had nothing to do with it. They had nothing to do with it. As you know, she has this great line in the play where she says, "I'm a vegetarian. I wouldn't kill anybody.
I'm a hippie. Who would get me?"
I saw Brooke Shields do that, by the way, on YouTube recently. And she said, "I'm a vegetarian." But
a matter of fact.
And the great tragedy is that although she indeed was let go finally, her husband didn't make it. And that's maybe the greatest tragedy of all.
And she lost her parents when she was
parents died while she was in prison. And she has been out there now for many years as a very vocal activist. Sonny Jacobs, has taken this, as she says in the play, her memorial is going to be that she lived, that she lived. Her husband didn't make it. So there's one scene where I play the husband, and even as I sit here now, I think about them, and it kind of gets to me. He writes a letter to her, which he reads to her. The affectation is she's reading it, but you actually hear his voice doing it, and it's very moving because it's real. It's really what he wrote to her and what he said to her from his prison to her prison.
Very real. Yeah. Ed Delbert Tibbs, of course the character I play, was convicted in 1974 of murdering a man and raping his companion. He was wrongly imprisoned in Florida for 3 years, and here we go with Florida again, the South.
We've got now, Florida and Texas as recurring themes
and
here.
That's why I want to make a point about it. What's your take of Delbert and how that worked out for him?
Well, on Delbert, and before I get to Delbert, I will give kudos also to Leslie Story.
Oh yes, she did a wonderful job.
A very strong performance as Sonny. She's very believable.
Definitely.
Delbert Tibbs is a poet. He has a poetic outlook on life, and he is a published poet, and he continues to be. He's out, and he writes. He has a website. I don't know that he's thriving, but he's coping, certainly.
He's coping.
And what happened is that Delbert wasn't even in the state where the crime was committed at the time it was committed, and it was proven that he was not in the footprint of the state of Florida when the crime was committed, and yet he was convicted. So you have to ask yourself, how could such a thing happen if there weren't racism, if there weren't some level of corruption, if there weren't bigotry? Because clearly there couldn't have been enough evidence to get a conviction. And the racism that's still pervasive, I think, is that one of Delbert's lines, and I'm paraphrasing what you say, is that you can't have a murderer running around, and if there's a black man and he looks like he might match the description, he might as well be guilty because he's going to be convicted.
Yeah. Jerry, you touch a little about racism in the South and your experience in college. Right. Do you feel like it's really a pervasive part of the criminal justice system where black men are sort of, the word colorless, meaning it doesn't matter which one they get? Yeah. Because that's the take I get from it.
I mean, I think that was certainly the case, during the years that this play portrays. Hopefully, it's getting better. I haven't had personal experience in recent years in the South with these kind of, these kind of issues. But you look at a character, the character that Stan plays, David Keaton. Here's a black man who was accused of murdering a police officer who looked nothing like the real person. They said was what, 5'6", and he's 6'2", but he has the misfortune of having an afro. and the sheriff says, well, this guy had an afro. Well, if he had an afro and he's black,